Welcome to another episode of the Spiritual Awakening Show. This is another part of the Kundalini Awakening series, and today I'm joined by Mahesi Caplan. Welcome, Mahesi. Thanks so much for joining us today for a conversation all about the Kundalini process.
Yeah, not a problem. Look forward to it.
All right, so I'll give you a little bit of an intro here, Mahesi, for our audience, and then we'll get you to share your story. You've got a really fascinating one, coming at it from a little bit of a different perspective than some of the things that I've shared so far throughout the series. You come from a Buddhist background, and I really appreciate the ideas from Buddhism. And I would love to see the way that you've incorporated it into your Kundalini process. So Mahesi is coming us today from Devon's, South Hams in the UK, near the sea, really beautiful landscapes. I was just looking up some images there, really, really stunning place. And Mahesi's got over 30 years of Kundalini experience and 15 years of training as a Buddhist monk. Today, Mahesi shares his wisdom online. He's got a YouTube channel, and that's actually how I found you, Mahesi, and your work. I was browsing YouTube. I think somebody had sent me your channel, and they said, hey, check out some of these talks. And I really enjoyed not only your messages, but there was a palpable feeling of peace coming through what you were sharing. And there's a difference between, I listen to many different speakers and they all transmit something significant, but from your videos in particular, I felt peace, not necessarily an energetic transmission. It wasn't even very flashy or loving. It was just very peaceful. And listening to your voice was soothing, it was comforting, and your storytelling was really enjoyable. And so that's why I reached out to have you on the show. I think our audience will really benefit from what you have to share today.
Thanks.
As well, thank you. As well, along with your YouTube channel, I know that you offer spiritual direction and support. You offer online retreats and classes to those traveling the journey. Sometimes they're having difficulty, and you're a resource that they can reach out to. So today, my intention with this series is to have guests on like yourself that are grounded, coming at this whole far out topic of spirituality and spiritual awakening from a human perspective that is clear. And I'm excited to see where this conversation goes. The intention behind this series overall with these interviews that I have is to have people on like yourself to share your story, to let others out there know, hey, I'm not the only one going through this really weird stuff. I'm not the only one. There's a guy like Mahesi out there. He's been through this and he's stable. He's able to talk about it with confidence, not as a victim. And not only that, but also not with intense attachment to some of the more flashy, exciting phenomena. And that's something that I got from your talks. You were mentioning a little bit about a very common theme that we see amongst people that go through Kundalini process, which is attachment to the story. Either the story of Kundalini is happening to me and I'm a victim. This is a really bad, difficult thing that's happened to me in my life, almost as if, they've got like some sort of diagnosis. And then on the other hand, there's the attachment to the fascination. Wow, this amazing thing, Kundalini has happened to me and I'm a little special and I'm a little bit, I'm certified spiritual, right? And on my journey, I seem to have fallen into the latter camp. I wasn't really victimized by this. I didn't feel that this was a horrible thing. I got excited. I said, whoa, this is really cool. Kundalini's happening to me. This is a sign of something great. I'm special. And I think that reflects a little bit throughout my work and my series itself, right? This is very Kundalini focused. I really love it. I think that I can be honest and admit that I do have some attachment to the Kundalini story. And so I really love the way that you were speaking about this topic of attachment to the story. And there was a point in my journey where I met with my mentor who had gone through Kundalini process as well. And I said, hey, look, really insane things are happening to me. Do I keep this to myself, private, personal, in the way that, some other people out there are very secretive very tight-lipped about some of their phenomena and experiences? Or do I start openly talking about this? What do I do? And she said, look, some things, they must be kept personal. They must be kept private. They're sacred. Others don't need to hear about it. But a few things here and there, when the time is right, with the right context, share. Just so that people know that, yeah, this is a real thing, that this is a possibility, that there's more to life than just the, material world, that there are potentials to have energetic phenomena, to have spiritual, mystical experiences and whatnot. And so with that said, I would invite you to share your story with that sort of intention. Please note, we're not going to, look at you and say, oh, look at this guy claiming this or claiming that. No, we're here to share, just to let people know they're not alone. They're not crazy. Support is out there. And like I said, you're a great storyteller as well. And so let's all sit back and enjoy a little bit of our conversation here today with Mahesi. Mahesi, please take us back to those early days. And there was sort of inklings of spiritual process, of Kundalini process happening for you. How did it all start?
Hi. Well, thanks for the introduction. I just want to premise this by saying you've got to take what I have to say with a pinch of salt. I don't believe there are really any kind of absolute experts on this subject. And so, I offer this in the spirit of letting whatever sort of understanding I've acquired over time share it as best I can. But I'm not claiming to be the last word on anything, even though I may sound like I am at times. So I guess it's interesting to start looking right back into childhood, because I think people have inklings of the fact that there is something enormous inside the sphere of their experience that is not the I that they feel that they are, that they're actually in that interior space. They're living in association with something huge that is of high voltage and is enormous and is very, very powerful. And I believe all human beings have a semblance of awareness that this thing, this other thing, exists in them. And it can be a great source of anxiety in life, period. And I think schools of psychology that I'm interested in would argue that the presence of this other thing inside of our subjective space that is not I is a source of stress and anxiety for us, because we don't really know what to make of it. It's a kind of subliminal or subconscious bewilderment. What the hell am I supposed to make of this? And in the school of Jungian psychology, the process of drawing on the intrinsic benefits and blessings of what is there is the process of individuation. So the individuation, in a sense, is coming into conscious relationship with this huge high voltage presence, but remaining coherent as a human being and not becoming so grandiose and inflated that you think, I am the one. And so I would say, and I'm sort of mentioning this because, the inklings that I'm going to point to, I would say, are footprints that what you're calling Kundalini leave as hints of its presence, for example. So as a child, I would say that, the earliest memory that I would have that's relevant to what I'm trying to say would be wondering about where's the end of the universe. And then reaching the point where I've would sense, well, if I've reached the end, then what's beyond the end? So there's a searching or a sense of there being a scale, something of great scale that's almost infinite in its scale that I was living in, so that was just a very early sign. And that was happening, when I was like 3, 4, 5 years old, this kind of wandering. Then another thing that started to occur when I was young was I would find these transitional spaces, like sitting in the middle of the stairs, you know, not in a place, but in transition between this sort of seeming solidity of place or certainty of place. And I would ask myself, who am I? Where is the I that, where am I in my experience? And I would look to find myself inside of my experience. And then I would have this kind of almost, it's like a bolt of lightning would go through me, like a huge electric shock. And I now in later life understand that really this was a kind of defense mechanism against what I was discovering, that I could not find or see the self that everyone was telling me I am. It didn't actually, it wasn't discoverable. And so associated with that insight was this huge explosion of energy that served to protect me in a way, but also to hint at the presence of something, again, huge in the vicinity of my life that I really didn't have much cognizance of or knowledge of. So I would say these are all very early hints of the presence of this thing that, you know, you're calling Kundalini, but I want to sort of slightly unpack it and try and explore the possibility of its presence in other areas of our lives that we wouldn't typically associate with Kundalini. So next to that, I started to get into photography. I trained as a photographer, and in the course of my time at college, I started to get this sense of a luminosity inside of objects. So my photography started to become a search for this sense of a kind of quality of light or energy that I was sensing inside of objects. And you can see that in some of my early photographs, quite high contrast. And, you know, I take a photo of a stone or something, and, you know, I felt that there was this life force coming out from inside of the stone. And again, this is early signs of being sensitive to something bigger than the kind of conventional packaging of my, you know, my sense of self. So then kind of what happened next? I'm just trying to remember. The next sort of thing that began to happen was I started to get this incredible sense of silence in the midst of busy places. And so the sights and sounds would recede into the background, and what would come into the foreground would be this sense of space and silence. And that was more real and more present in some way than all the activity that was passing through it. And there was this sort of sense of something eternal that was there before, you know, all these cities and people and everything arose, and something eternal that will remain when they've gone. Excuse me. So again, that sense of scale, the enormity of that field of awareness, again, was hinting. It was a footprint of what was to come, and I believe. And then, I mean, I'm not going to go into the full story, but I would say the first sort of intimate sense of an association with Kundalini impacting me occurred when I was staying at Samueling Monastery. I was still only a teenager, but I remember waking up in the middle of the night, and it was the first time I really ever felt whole body bliss throughout my whole body. Something that I'd never experienced before, you know, just, you know, going to a sort of conventional school and all the rest of it. This is not a topic of conversation. I don't think the idea of bliss is discussed in many schools, even today. And so that sense of bliss, again, was an intimation of grace somehow emerging from something outside of me that I couldn't understand. I didn't really have a conscious relationship with, but it was beginning to penetrate, beginning to permeate into my life experientially. One thing led to another, and I think in my early 20s, I think I was only 21, I went on a retreat with a teacher called Chubunag. it was on that retreat where he was teaching me breathing exercises, and we were doing a lot of meditation, that this sort of supposed Kundalini experience hit. And it's just a tremendous intensification of life force, that you become conscious of, and it penetrates into our conventional self structure. It breaks it down and it shows its face, and you make that link, you synchronize with it, you make that connection. And my presumption is that it does it because, in a sense, there's a readiness for it to emerge. It's not something I sought. It's not something I forced. It's not something I even knew existed. And so, I wasn't one of those people that you sometimes see in the forum. How do I awaken my Kundalini? That just doesn't make sense to me. What makes sense to me is respecting the process of inquiry and investigation, and just take and accept whatever seems to be pertinent to that time and place. So when that experience happened, and it was extremely intense, I think I lost a stone in weight in about 5 days. And it felt like there was a possibility I could die, in fact, but because I trusted that force, I felt there was some sort of benevolence in it, or it was natural in some way. I was willing to surrender to the process, and I didn't overcomplicate it by thinking, oh God, what's happening? Why me? I don't want this or anything. There was just none of that. I just accepted it and let it be. And in a sense, that's really been the case ever since. Some people were concerned whether I had gone crazy in some sense, and I got checked out by a few psychologists and everything. But I quickly realized that what I was experiencing was just sort of completely outside the realm of what people are normally dealing with. And I quickly recognized that, in a sense, I'm pretty much on my own with this. Certainly at that stage, I didn't feel there was anyone around who could particularly help me. So I did start searching, though, for support of some sort. And I started going to the Edinburgh Buddhist Society at Edinburgh University, which was run incredibly well. I mean, they had some fantastic teachers coming. And I met this young monk called Ajahn Ananda at the time. He was a young American ex-Marine. And, it's one thing to meet a kind of an old 70-year-old Tibetan Lama. You can sort of appreciate, okay, they've got this quality of spiritual presence about them, but you don't necessarily identify with the life that they've led. It's another matter when you meet a kind of young, kind of funky American young guy who you can very much identify with the life that they've led, even though, I was never in the Marines. I could just sense, he was a Westerner. We could, he wasn't that much older than me. And I was really struck and impressed by some qualities that he had. I recognized I've not encountered this in a Westerner before. Also, he had a quality of composure about them, which was very impressive. And I think maybe subconsciously I recognized there's something here, to learn. And I went down to the monastery for a festival day, and then I met some other monks, all Westerners, all young. And I was pretty starstruck. I just thought, there's a quality here that I'm picking up that, I need to get into association with. So I ordained and became a Buddhist monk. And, Ajahn Ananda, as I said, was a Marine. So I did get subjected to quite a disciplined regime, which was good for me because, I was a big softy mama's boy. And we were getting up at 4 a.m, and we were doing, long periods of meditation. And, one thing that I always remember is we went on winter retreat where we were doing about 6-7 hours of meditation a day, and I got flu. And my normal expectation when I got flu is that I get to stay in bed and be taken care of, but he required me to actually just carry on doing the meditation, even when I had, snot streaming down my face. I always remember sitting there because he sat on a sort of slightly higher seat in front of me, him watching me sort of going through these hours of meditation. And what I recognized is, I was being strengthened by that, by learning to face dis-ease, face discomfort, face what I regarded as a limitation or a limit to what was reasonable for me. Had I been at home, I would be like being in bed waiting for soup to be delivered while I listened to the radio or something. Whereas I wasn't getting that treatment, I was being told to face it. And what was remarkable is how from moment to moment I could transcend the discomfort and be okay, or have the experience of the discomfort being okay. And that's what the discipline forced me to do. So I know you're going to ask me, how did I incorporate the Kundalini experience into my monastic training? Well, I don't believe that having Kundalini experience means that we're not, we don't need to be responsible to the spiritual process in the same way as everybody else does. If you see what I'm saying, it's not a Willy Wonka golden ticket to the chocolate factory. You still got to do the spiritual work, and that spiritual work I found, was very much, I was very much grounded in through the monastic training. And fundamentally, that was about facing things I didn't want to face, learning to cultivate the strength to sustain presence to those things. And all of that synced very well with my Kundalini experience, even though the sort of specifics of Kundalini were not being addressed. The fact that I was learning to cultivate the sustained presence was very enabling of the Kundalini being incorporated. Now, I wouldn't call it Kundalini from within the monastic sphere. I just call it vitality or vital force. So, and also it has another quality to it, which we might describe as light. So it has this quality of light, and the presence of luminosities is very much there in the tradition I was in. And the presence of infinities is very much present in the tradition I was in. So, and the idea of something being immeasurable, and the idea of being non-conceptual and all the rest of it. So there were plenty ways of me to translate the sort of Kundalini culture into the Buddhist culture where it made sense. So I'll stop there and see if you've got any questions.
Right. So fascinating story so far. I've spoken about in my series about some questions that I had. Why don't some of these teachers or traditions speak directly about Kundalini? For example, in the way that I'm here talking about, Kundalini awakening so openly. And what I came to conclude for myself, I feel that this sort of satisfied my curiosity, was that whether you're going through Kundalini awakening or not, the practice is the same. You sit with what's arising, you let it come up, you observe it, you let it go, right? You meditate on it in the same way. Would you agree that the way that you were taught to meditate applies across the board, regardless of what's going on inside you?
Yeah, I believe I picked up some principles within the monastery that are, you don't have to be a Buddhist to subscribe to them, but nevertheless, they are universal. and quite simple. And there's a story that I like in the tradition that really says a lot. And it's a story where the Buddha is walking through the forest with a group of monks, and he picks up a handful of leaves, and he turns to the monks and says, "Which is more, all the leaves and all the trees in the forest, or the handful of leaves I hold in my hand?" And they said, "Well, Lord, there's a lot more leaves and all the trees in the forest than there are leaves in your hand." And he said, "So is that which I've understood, that which I've seen and understood can be compared to all the leaves and all the trees in the forest. But that which you need to know is a key to your liberation can be compared to the handful of leaves I hold in my hand." So, there's a real issue here. This is a real thing. I do believe there is an ignition key for all of this. And I think it's referred to in the Bible as well, where Christ talks about, the camel going through the eye of a needle. It's requires a certain kind of accuracy, a certain kind of focus, and a certain kind of understanding to understand what's critical and what's simply just fascinating, but not relevant to your personal liberation. And so the question of fascination is seriously problematic, because fascination becomes a proxy for aliveness. It's an alternative center of aliveness that then starts to serve as, your core point of reference for when you're wanting to sort of feel better. But it's an addiction. It's not the true source of aliveness that we're all fundamentally seeking. It's a distraction, it's an addiction. And so in some ways, I think this is why the Buddhist tradition, and I think it's a skillful means, tends to keep things sort of unfascinating. I mean, there's nothing particularly fascinating about being told that you've got to learn to be accommodating to pain.
Right.
It doesn't serve your need to be fascinated. And this is a very, very human thing that we do, become fascinated with all the leaves and all the trees in the forest. And then we lose sight of the real core, simple mechanism of release that we're seeking, or that we should be focusing on if we really want to progress spiritually. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I know that Zen Buddhism is a bit more of an extreme when it comes to the dismissal of the fascination and on a phenomena. I think they have a word, makyo, which is like it's a distraction, or it's phenomena, it's irrelevant. It's like a very dismissive term that they use. So if somebody were to mention maybe, some Kundalini phenomena, my spine is doing that, oh, it's makyo. Oh, I had some energy chakra thing. It's all makyo. And within the traditions that you practice in, did they have a term like that, or an attitude towards it like that? Or were they more understanding and willing to hear you out, but then you would still return to the same practices and attitudes? Or were they also very, that's not a thing, don't worry about it?
No, I mean, there was room to discuss everything within the monasteries,
Okay.
And certainly within the monastic community, there were many people having amazing spiritual experiences of all kinds. I've had many amazing spiritual experiences for all kinds, but also within that culture, there was, as the community matured, a growing recognition that all of these spiritual experiences arise and pass away. They all are of that nature, and you can't really hold on to them. And so in a sense, they're just like farts in the breeze, so to speak. I mean, they're fundamentally not, I don't want to diminish them or dismiss them entirely, but they don't last. So they have no substance. So there was always this pointing back to what is the relationship to your body mind right now? How integrated is it right now? How present are you able to be right now, even if it's just boring and mundane and you're doing the dishes? There's as much spirituality in that as there is in having, clouds of lotuses sort of flying out of your crown chakra. They both fundamentally of this one taste, arising and passing away. So once you begin to, in a sense, attune to the momentum that is the course of life, that river of life, that movement of life, which is the flow of things arising and passing away. Once you attune to that, you do find a core of stillness within that is, in a sense, if you think of a wheel, that's moving, every spoke on that wheel is moving, but at the very center, there's a point of stillness. So lotuses coming out the top of your crown chakra, or the sensation of water while you're doing the dishes and standing at the sink, they're fundamentally of that sort of one taste of impermanence, of arising, passing away, and the embracing of them all with equanimity results in this center of stillness arising. So, one of my teachers always used to say, the Buddhist tradition is fundamentally emphasizing stillness over and above luminosities and, fireworks, because all of that is impermanent. And also it's a wisdom tradition. So we're interested in the phenomenon. And as I've said in other interviews, I am a phenomenologist. So I'm interested in the phenomenon of lotuses coming out the top of my head, but I'm also interested in the phenomenon of, sitting at a bus stop waiting for the bus. They're both phenomenon. They're both up for contemplation. So, it's a contemplative tradition. And so we're looking at everything. We're looking at everything that can be seen, everything that can be heard, everything tasted, all body sensations. So it's like an elephant's footprint. The Kundalini gets included in that, not excluded. So it's not diminished. It still has its, it still is sacred in a sense, but it's sacred phenomenon. But also sitting at the bus stop becomes sacred phenomenon when it's properly understood. So then everything gets woven together into this singular tapestry. And in a sense, this is how I've related to my Kundalini. I think if someone sat inside of my body, I mean, maybe the same in your case, if somebody unfamiliar with the sort of the way things can move sat inside of my body and felt what was happening when I sort of let it happen, they would be a bit bemused. They'd be very bemused, in fact.
Right. Yeah, I can totally see that.
I mean, and so, Kundalini is an evolutionary force of nature. That much I can, we can say. But it's an evolutionary force of nature that's affecting us all. We all have intimations of this incredible power, as I say, and you see it in movies. If you think of the Incredible Hulk, for example, that moment, where he's humiliated, whatever, and then this force comes into him and he blows up into this giant kind of green anger monster. We all have that inside of us. That's the force, the voltage of Kundalini, in a sense, expressed through anger. We all have a kind of voltage inside of us, that wants to sleep with every woman or every man in the world. If we had the opportunity, we'd want more than one partner. We'd want infinite partners. We could sleep with a Chinese person and an Indian person and everything. We've all got a bit of that inside of us. It's an appetite that goes beyond what's humanly possible. Limitlessness is what we seek. The Highway 61, the open road, the freedom. We all have if someone said to you, I'm going to offer you all the money in the world, you'd probably say yes, because who wouldn't want all the money in the world, So we've got that in us. We've also got within us the idea of being seen by everybody. Everyone sees us, everyone loves us, everyone blesses us. We are a superstar. And just look at the word superstar. How much energy is in a star, luminosity, light, all of this. So, and it goes on when it comes to the whole process of understanding. We love understanding. We can eroticize it to the point where we want to know everything, and we want to be a channel for all knowledge. We want to tune into the Akashic records, and so we have these fantasies of enormous high voltage limitlessness, but then on the other hand, we suffer from things like depression. Depression really is, in my understanding, is a symptom of our fear of coming into association with this high voltage energy. It's a shutting down. It's a controlling and shutting down. All creativity comes from this high voltage energy. All genius comes from it. All beauty comes from it. All visions come from it. And it can be a source of incredible good, because it will transform us into basically wisdom and compassion if we establish the right relationship to it. But if we establish a greedy relationship to it, or an unconscious relationship to it, bad things are going to happen. It doesn't take kindly to being mistreated in any way. So it has to be treated with great respect, and you have to allow it to give you what gifts it chooses to give you, without trying to juice the orange too hard, or it won't appreciate being used for personal purposes.
Right. I
Does that
really
make sense?
yeah, it totally does. And that speaks to those who feel that they have to now do something about their Kundalini process. Okay, I've got Kundalini. What can I do to make it work? It's going to do what it's going to do. And if you try to push or try to manipulate it or control it, like you said, you're going to find out it doesn't tolerate that.
Well, I had an accelerated learning experience with that, because I was stuck on a meditation cushion for hours and hours, days, months, sometimes all night sittings, and I spent years trying to get it to do my will. And eventually you reach a point where there's a recognition, the futility of that effort. You just surrender. In the end, you just surrender. You just give up. And meditation is very much about essentially learning to surrender and giving up, and just letting the meditation do you, as opposed to you doing the meditation.
Right. Well
Let the
said.
meditation come to you, because there's nothing wrong in trying to manipulate things to go your way. I mean, that's what we're up to in any case. But what the process of meditation does is it frustrates it to the extent that it eventually dies as a habit, because nothing that you do actually works. But you've got to try it all, and try it all more than once, but eventually you'll just recognize it doesn't work, and you when that dies, then the real meditation kind of begins.
Right.
That kind of surrender.
Mm-hmm. That's been my experience with meditation. I practiced Vipassana for 10 days at a retreat. And the first few days I was, all over the place, couldn't sit still, trying to adjust my cushion, trying to adjust everything. And during the interview with the teacher, he mocked me. He said, "Oh, I see you at the back of the room. You can't sit still." And then he started to, mimic me moving around. And he was right. And there was a point where even after he told me that, I still couldn't settle in, but there was a point of that release. And then finally, I didn't want to get up. I was I didn't want to move. It was something had opened up in me, but it was through the frustration. It had to be exhausted out of me.
That's
Um,
right.
you mentioned a few minutes ago something, you said it really beautifully, and I won't be able to repeat it exactly the way that you said, but you said that in your view, in the view that you were trained in, the Buddhist view, everything is embraced. Not Kundalini, awakening, washing the dishes, waiting at the bus stop. It's all embraced impartially. You know, we look at them all impartially. I like to think of it as, you know, it's either all a miracle or none of it is. And I like the way that you said that, you know, we're not diminishing Kundalini. Yeah, it's a thing, but so is sitting at the bus stop. So I'm curious now, some people have taken this idea that we see in some traditions where they don't put this huge emphasis on Kundalini awakening. They don't talk about it. They don't have a name for it. They've taken, oh, because they don't talk about it, that must mean it's invalid. And they do diminish it. And we see that sometimes in non-dual circles and from non-duality.
Yeah.
Can you comment on that? Are they misappropriating this idea of everything is to be seen equally? And are they going the opposite direction and, you know, shutting down these processes and saying, oh, it's phenomena, it's irrelevant, it's you know, ego attachment? Can you comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I don't buy any of that. I mean, it's whatever is arising has its place, no matter what. You know, I don't want to go too deeply into the sort of whole Neo-Advaita tradition, but it's not something I align with, because there's this kind of ideological fanaticism that I encounter in it. You know, where it, you know, as it says, it just disregards everything, including life itself.
Yes.
And I think it's an expression of where we are, but by tendency as a society, pretty disembodied from the neck down, inclined to acquire ideologies and apply them very aggressively and violently. You know, getting a glimpse of something that may be true and genuine. I don't disregard that, but you know, that is still, in my estimation, a place of unconscious incompetence. It's not a mature awakening, you know, because I think you know, someone who has a mature awakening is very inclusive of everything. So I'm inclusive in a sense of Advaita as a stepping stone, but certainly not as definitive of an end point, which they tend to claim that they're pointing to. And you can sort of pick it up in the force of the way they assert this stuff. You know, that forcefulness is not very free. You know, it's coming from a place of compression. And so I just don't buy that. You know, I don't feel, certainly in my tradition, was dismissive of Kundalini. I don't think it understood it in the traditional kind of Kundalini school, Kundalini tradition way. But look, there's this core teaching in Buddhism. In fact, even the reference to breathing, if you unpick the word anapanasati, the word anapanasati, which is often translated as breathing meditation, that word ana comes from the idea of atman, but also atmosphere. It has its roots in the word atmosphere. Now, once you start looking into what atmosphere means, you're looking at like a vapor sphere. It's a sphere of vapor. Now, that may sound very far out, but if you just shut your eyes and look inside your body and look at the experience you have of your body, there is actually no boundary there. It's quite vapor-like, and it's a sphere of vapor. It doesn't actually have any edges or boundaries or limits. So you're already into something enormous there that you're being referenced to. So anapanasati, and then the other thing, the word pana comes from the idea of pranas. So here you are looking at holy wind, cosmic electricity, kundalini, chi, whatever you want to call it. But it's there simply in the word that is normally translated as mindfulness of breathing. And then sati means being present to. So if you translate it in an alternative way, you can come up with ideas such as being present to the electricity of the ultimate, or the aliveness of the vapor sphere. So again, I think it's misapprehended because of where we come from at this time and place in our in culture. We think, well, it's just the breath coming in through the nose. But this isn't what the Buddha was teaching. He was teaching about this whole body experience of what I call the inner breath, or the subtle breath, permeating through every pore in your skin. And with pointing out instruction, all of that can be taught very quickly, so that you move away from this very mechanistic idea that we have of the breath coming through the nose, and you feel this subtle movement of aliveness coming in and out through your toes, through your knees, through every cell simultaneously. So then you're beginning to tune into this field of aliveness that is this high voltage presence of Kundalini. And then it will start to do its work on you, appropriate to your circumstances, your makeup, your karmic sort of makeup. And then, you don't force it from there. You pass the whole project over to life itself.
Oh,
So
that's such a beautiful way of putting it. That's a really beautiful way of putting it. You pass the whole project over to life itself. Thank you.
Yeah. Pleasure. So, and that is just the first teaching in the Buddhist teaching, with reference to what is often called the 4 foundations of mindfulness. So that, all the Kundalini is definitely there in it. It's just not discussed in a similar way. And there's what we might call the upaya, or the skillful means, the means that are being used to facilitate your entry into direct experience of it, is just different to the Kundalini path. I'm not saying it's better, it's just an alternative approach. So, because what it just says is, well, look at the phenomenon that you can know. So immediately we're not excluding those people who aren't having Kundalini experience. So we've already cast a much wider net by saying, let's just start with the body itself. We can all relate to that. We've all got a body. So that net covers everybody. We don't have this exclusive community of Kundalini experiencers and all those who are outsiders. So basically, no one wants to be an outsider.
Mm-hmm.
My partner does not experience Kundalini in the way I do. So if I talk to her just in terms of Kundalini, she feels like an outsider. But doesn't mean she's not got a spiritual life. It just, but it turns her off. And I believe it's probably the same for a lot of people.
Yeah.
But then
totally
if we talk about, let's just start with the fact you've got a body, that does, well, I can relate to that. I do have a body. And then, what the Buddhist tradition starts to do is, well, it says, okay, you've got a body, let's focus in and see what it actually is. I mean, have you ever really inquired deeply into what this body is? And so then it gives instruction about how to do that in conjunction with this breathing that I described, so that, you start to be encouraged to look at the body in particular ways, heart, nails, teeth, skin, liver, blood, saliva, teeth. Just become aware of the fact that they're there, and again, you're not excluded from this because you've got all of those phenomena in the field of your experience. So you're, in a sense, you're being what you might call gently scaled in to something that is accessible. And then that rabbit hole starts, in a sense, getting deeper and deeper the more you go through these foundations of mindfulness. So, you once you make contact with, say, the saliva in your mouth, then you can recognize that has a sensation associated with it. There's a sensation. And so then you're into the second sphere of mindfulness, which is to do with sensations. And with pointing out instruction, the sensation of the saliva in your mouth as a sensation doesn't have an end to it. It's without limit. You cannot say the sensation of the saliva in my mouth starts here but ends there. Inside the sensation, you can't find an end to the sensation. So again, once all this is being pointed out, you start scaling in to a different way of experiencing the phenomenon, the seeming phenomenon of your body. And so once you get to the sensations field, and again, remember, you're constantly working with the breath in relation to this exploration, you enter into this third foundation of mindfulness, which is called Chitanasati. And, you know, this is where the teachings can get very confusing because different teachers sort of describe it in different ways. But basically, you're looking at the way your mind expands when it's in full cognizant relationship or full awareness of whatever you're experiencing, the sensation, and how it contracts when you suddenly resist it and you come back into being me against it, or me being victimized by the pain in my knee or whatever. So this is a way we scale people into, and you know, as you get deeper and deeper, then this process of awakening is going to occur. You know, this is an ignition to a great awakening, because the thing that knows this is a quality of awareness that is other than you. It's a quality of intelligence, a quality of universal intelligence that has this curiosity, you know, and you begin to discover, well, there is this wisdom faculty that actually wants to know this stuff, and it's hardwired into the universe. And it's kind of like why we're here, you know, it's kind of like, this is kind of like human birth is like homework that we've been given to do in order to enrich and deepen our understanding of all things. And once you start aligning with that homework, you feel like, right, you're sort of on track, and you can feel this deepening that's occurring. And that can be done in association with the sensations and phenomena associated with Kundalini or not. You know, the Buddha said there are 4 ways people awaken: fast with little pain, or slow with little pain, or fast with lots of pain, or slow with lots of pain. So if you're slow with lots of pain, it may be that you're going to have to go through a whole Kundalini thing, you know, with all the sensations and purifications and everything that go along with that. If you're fast with little pain, you may not have a Kundalini thing, because it's just like, boom, you know, illumination, everything makes sense. You know, the ego self-axis establishes itself, and you can just be a channel for truth. So Kundalini may mean that actually we're down for a bit of tidying up, whereas people who don't have Kundalini may have done that tidying up. So it's not necessarily doesn't necessarily mean we're the most spiritual person in the room.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And that is a good way to reframe and flip the script. To examine it from a different angle. I like the way that you were describing, you know, nobody wants to feel excluded, right? We don't want to make it seem as if, you know, I'm going through Kundalini, you're not, I'm different, maybe superior, special. Conversely as well, I think this speaks to a lot of people that are going through Kundalini who feel, which is probably the most common issue that I come across with people that approach me about Kundalini, is they feel, I can't relate with other people anymore. I can't relate with people who aren't going through the process. So rather than excluding others, they've excluded themselves. But what you're saying is, hey, we can all relate. You have a body, you have spit in your mouth. We can relate on those levels, right?
Of course. Look, I lived with Kundalini experience for years without ever talking to anybody about it, really, because, you know, I recognized most people weren't experiencing this. It didn't make any sense to them. It may not be your intention to make people feel lesser than you or diminished. But I mean, if you start saying I've got this spiritual electricity going through me, people immediately recognize, well, I don't. So it immediately creates a point of separation. And I've sold incense on the Totnes market, surrounded by kind of market traders and stuff, and I would never speak to them about this stuff unless it's kind of in jest. Sometimes, they know I was a Buddhist monk, so we kind of make jokes sometimes. But I don't feel any need for them to have any cognizance for the fact that I can feel my crown chakra wide open and I can feel radiance sort of coming through me while I'm maybe standing there speaking to them. Just learn, they don't need, there's not a need for them to know this unless the circumstances arise where there may be a need for them to know. And again, this is also built into the tradition. Our tradition, or the tradition I was trained in, was one where you didn't teach unless you were asked, in a sense. So also, same kind of applies to the whole sort of Buddhist side of the tradition. I really don't impose it on people unless they invite it.
Right.
And so you have to learn to accept that your specialness may not be visible to everybody. And, a lot of the reasons we want to talk about it is because we want to affirm our specialness, if we're honest. I'm not saying that's necessarily the case, but you have to, I don't know in people's cases, but we have to ask ourselves whether there is some of that going on.
Yeah. Yeah, there definitely was for me. And you described, you used the word mature, and I feel that there was a maturation process that I had to go through to be shut down, to try and show, hey, this happened to me, I'm special. And to people just, like, what the hell is this guy talking about? Eventually you go through this maturation process, and I realized, well, now today I'm almost, not even almost, I'm averse to talking about this. Unless it's within a very clear context that, if that's I was at a party, like, people know I'm into yoga and meditation. And if I'm at a party and somebody mentions it, I don't divulge too much.
It's just a lesson you learn. I mean, in the monasteries, when I felt special. I mean, my Kundalini experience was wild. It was a total fireworks show. And no one else was having it. But then there were these other monks and nuns there that had power, that were radiant beings, that I was impressed by, that I knew were ahead of me in this journey, and they weren't having these experiences. So eventually I recognized, okay, I'm having this experience, but actually it's not making me more special than these other people who are getting there in some other way. And that helped temper the kind of natural grandiosity that's going to come along with this. Now, you have to have compassion for the fact that there is going to be inflation. It's an inevitability. So, it doesn't mean you're a bad person because you became grandiose and inflated. That is a stage in the journey, but the more mature stage in the journey is when that inflation bubble gets burst. So it's called stage 3 initiation, the inflation stage, where you think you've got it, and the universe is talking through you. That's only stage 3 of 7. It's early stage. And it's called unconscious incompetence, the stage of unconscious incompetence, where you think you're together, but you're unconscious of the fact that you've made an overestimation. Then 4th stage initiation is called conscious incompetence, or the depressive position. That's more mature than the charismatic stage. It's where there's a realism about how hard this is going to be to really fully integrate this into my human life, and it's a much more it's more modest, less charismatic place to be. And then it goes on to conscious competence. So you reach a point where you recognize, okay, so let's call it Kundalini is beginning to really integrate with body and mind, and my sense of self, or let's say my thinking mind is no longer the governor anymore. It's the servant of this, and is being informed and serving this. But there's still a self-conscious recognition that has happened. And then the 6th stage initiation is called unconscious competence, where you reach a point where it's experienced just as, this is just a natural way of being, a growing up. It doesn't define me in any particular way. The sun shines, but it doesn't just shine on me.
Mm-hmm.
Just because I'm experiencing the sun shining doesn't mean that I'm special, because the sun simply just shines anyway, as the awakened mind just shines, or the diamond body just shines, or the divine within, or the grace within. It just shines on you. And it may well be that it's penetrated into your heart, penetrated into your mind, penetrated into your body, and all that is more and more coordinated and flowing naturally. But that is just a birthright of every human being. It just so happens that you've claimed your birthright. And 7th stage initiation is setting up ways and means for other people to claim their birthright in the same way as you have.
Beautiful. I really like the clarity of the breakdown there, because it makes it so easy to understand where you might be and what is the work that you have to do without getting ahead of yourself. And that's what I really like about Buddhism, is that there's such a great structure around all of this. They're not just wigging it. They're not just, making it up on the fly. This is a very, very old tradition that in some respects you could say maybe it has all the answers, not necessarily all the specific answers, but it has the answers to all of the challenges that we may face as we go through this. Can you comment on that? Do you think that?
Yeah, no, I mean, my feeling is there's a great depth of wisdom within the tradition. Now, I don't necessarily believe that even people ordained within the tradition are necessarily accessing the great depth of wisdom within the tradition. It's debatable. It's like any tradition, there's factions and different types of interpretation, and there's literalists and there's interpreters and there's the works. Now, I'm definitely an extreme interpreter. So, you have to bear that in mind. I'm not representative necessarily of other teachers that you may get more sense out of for yourself. But, I see the Buddhist tradition as a vehicle. I don't, I'm not a fanatical Buddhist. And, I've taken a lot from the Western psychological traditions and sort of woven it all together. But when it comes down to it, there's a degree of wisdom that comes from early Buddhist tradition that's very, very simple, very, very direct, and incredibly potent. And, this idea of, the Buddha was not saying that life is suffering. He's not saying that at all. The Buddha is saying that you will experience suffering if your relationship to life is not clear, or if your relationship to life is confused. And now that applies to Kundalini too. And those people who may be suffering with their Kundalini experience, and, I've seen these posts, like, oh, I've got this twitching in my ear, what am I going to do about it? And it's, or, I've got this force pressing in my head. I didn't ask for this. How do I get rid of it and stuff? And it's like, if this is your attitude, then you're going to get shredded.
Yeah,
it's going to be tough. I have a huge amount of discomfort due to the Kundalini process that pretty much goes on all of the time. I've just become accustomed to it and accept, there is no escape. It's the wisdom of no escape. So what the Buddha's teaching was really saying with regards to this experience of dis-ease or suffering is that when rightly understood with wisdom, with insight, it turns into an experience of freedom or freedom from suffering. So that the sense of claustrophobia that we experience around suffering and the experience of liberation that we long for are like the front and back of a hand. And so the key to dealing with all this discomfort that may come about as a result of Kundalini is being able to associate with the unpleasant sensations. I'm not going to be able to sort of go into a full sort of instruction on this, but in broad strokes, it's about being able to stay present to the dis-ease and uncomfortable sensations in a contemplative way until they reveal their essential nature, which is always, every sensation is always without limit. And once you get identified with the limitlessness in your experience, then the sensation just becomes far away. So the forest masters used to say, and let's put it into Kundalini language, they used to say, this Kundalini sensation of discomfort does not go away, but this Kundalini sensation of discomfort is experienced as being very far away.
Yeah.
Because it's arising and existing as a very small thing inside of a much bigger picture. And that enables you to stay relaxed with the process, to not apply resistance and let the Kundalini do whatever transformative work that it's going to do. That makes sense.
Yes. Yes.
So there's another story that I think is very important that I like to tell, because it's very, very powerful imagery to do with the sensations that people experience, whether they're Kundalini or not Kundalini, but there's certainly a lot of strong sensations that come for people experiencing Kundalini. And that is the Buddha basically saying there were lepers, leprosy, where you get that disease, the bubbling skin and everything, in India. And they used to live in little communities. And one way they would manage their leprosy is by building a brazier, a fire with metal, some metal, and they would literally sear their skin or burn their skin over the brazier. So the Buddha said the reason they burn their skin over the brazier is because they experience a change in sensation. They feel relieved of their disease. Okay? And then he said, well, if they didn't have the leprosy, though, would they be burning their skin on the brazier? Of course they wouldn't, because it wouldn't be a relief of disease. It would be the making of a disease that voluntarily that you didn't have to subject yourself to. So he says, so it is with us when we think about the things we do in our life. A lot of the things we do in our life, even in relation to Kundalini sensations, are to seek a change in sensation so as we feel relieved of our disease. So, we're doing this constantly, reaching for, switching on the TV or picking up the newspaper or picking up the phone, whatever. It's a constant process of trying to change sensation to feel relieved of a fundamental disease that, in a sense, is shaping all of this activity. So the Buddhist tradition is trying to point us to the root disease that is you could say the origin or the cause for all of this changing disease activity, so we can inquire into what that disease is really about. And when we find freedom within that disease, then we just become still and economous and open and free and unresistant, and we grow up.
We grow up. Yeah. Sense? Yeah, that does. It's very true.
So I would say,
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say so. Those people who are seeking to find the best way of dealing with the Kundalini experience, I feel I learned a lot from my Buddhist training that is relevant. So fundamentally, you can't change the way it is. It is as it is. It's too late if you want to say, I don't want this experience. You're having this experience. And if you're feeling oppressed by this experience, it's not that the experience is oppressing you, it's that you're fighting the way it is. You're resisting the way it is. And so the key to providing as much space to the Kundalini energy to do what it's trying to do, and it will be benevolent as long as you treat the process with respect. You can even talk to it in a respectful manner, is just get out the way. And you do that by learning, read my lips, patient endurance. Learn to patiently endure and just accept the way it is without making a big melodrama out of it and a personal story out of it. Just be patiently enduring of the way it is, and it will pass and bring gifts.
Beautiful. Yeah, that's been my experience. Patiently enduring. One of my mantras during some of the very dark periods of my process, the purification, was I'd read a poem by Scott Killaby. He's a spiritual teacher. He wrote a poem that said, I sat with infinite patience and I now sit in bliss. And I came across this poem almost, by grace, by synchronicity. And I thought, that's the answer. And
That is the answer.
That's it. I will sit with infinite patience. And he writes, I sat with infinite patience and I now sit in bliss. And I said, maybe the bliss will come, maybe it won't, but infinite patience, that's what I've got to do. And I like the way you've put it, patiently endure whatever's arising.
In the Buddhist tradition, we have this, in the Theravada tradition, this ceremony that happens on full moons and half moons, and it's to do with the discipline of the tradition, which you have to think of in terms of a crucible or a container that facilitates intensification of life force that you then learn to let go of through consciousness. So it's a 10,000 word chant that takes about an hour to do. And it's very, very fast, and it's all done from memory. It's quite a thing. But before that chant came into existence, in the very early stages of the tradition, they still had the ritual, but they had this very, very short chant. And the first line of that chant is, patient endurance is the supreme practice. And that is basically the absolute core of everything the Buddha taught. It's not exotic. It's not fireworks. It's not spiritual experiences. It's not being special. It's none of those things. It's about being able to get real and just stay with it without complaining.
Patient endurance. Thank you. I think a lot of people will take a lot from those very potent words there. So you left off your story, and we've had a really rich conversation so far. You left off your story. You were in your 20s. You're practicing in the monastery. Take us through some of the next 5-10 years. What was going on for you during your process, your awakening journey, your life in general?
Okay, so there's a thing that you learn through the monastic training. It was called sila. It's called containment. So, there's lots of sort of rules and things that limit you. For example, Saturday night, first monastery I was in was near Newcastle. Can't just jump in the car and go down into the town. That's what I've normally done. So in that sense, I was contained. But then the impulse to do that, to seek this change in sensation, was still there. So, you feel that pull, but you can't, because of the rules, you can't follow it. So, gradually what it does is it has a fuel that burns and then it dies. And then eventually you reach the point where it's Saturday and the thought to jump in a car and go into town just doesn't arise anymore because you burnt it out. And basically, I did that on many, many levels because of the way sila holds you and keeps you, in a sense, pinned. Means you're forced to face a lot of things. You might say, oh, I don't want to be here, I want to be somewhere else. So you have to just stay with that, wait till that burns out. You might fall in love. I fell in love inside the monastery. You might fall in love with someone, but then you can't make that connection. You can't have that relationship. So you have to feel that attraction, and because of the containment, you burn that out, and it goes on, and you can begin to imagine. You love the macaroni and cheese, but you don't see macaroni and cheese for 10 years. So you fantasize about macaroni and cheese, and then eventually, because you can't follow that desire, eventually it burns out. And as these things burn out, you begin to notice that there's this spaciousness that begins to open up, because all of those desires, which are, I would say, are really sort of you might call regressed forms of Kundalini, because desires can run very hot and intense and be very uncomfortable. What begins to happen is, it's like all that heat begins to dissipate, the heat of these desires. Like, you might like your coffee in a particular way in the morning, and then because we couldn't necessarily make our own coffee, someone brings you your coffee and it's not done the right way. You feel this incredible frustration and annoyance. And so the training is very comprehensive. It basically covers everything. So all of this stuff eventually gets burnt out. And then in the end, you just find yourself, well, this is how it is, and there's an acceptance of that. And the interior space that is accepting of that is big. It's big, it's still, and it just lets the way it is be, because it can't really do much about it in most instances. Now, some people will immediately say that must mean, I'm not that passive. I don't want to become this kind of passive rug, this passive thing that's just a pushover. It doesn't make you a pushover at all, because it means you respond to things with a great accuracy. And, if something is needing to be addressed, you address it without fear, but also without fanaticism.
Mm-hmm.
You do it with accuracy, so that's, within us, I've alluded to the Incredible Hulk, this anger thing. I would call it as an archetypal force. It's a kind of a warrior energy. So you have regressed warriors, which are like mercenaries, or if you think of, say, the Nazis, sadomasochists, they were sadistic on the one hand, and then when they were defeated, they carried on fighting and flipped into a masochist state. But then there's the good warrior. So what's the good warrior is not a mercenary, but serves the good of the people, and is much more heart-centered. In a sense, we've seen this in the Ukrainians. We think the Ukrainian military are good warriors. They're serving they're fighting for the good of the people, and we like that. And then we see the Russian military. We see they're sadomasochists and mercenaries fighting for themselves and fighting for their own aggrandizement of their nation. So we don't like that. So what happens is, you start to find the wholesome expressions of these archetypes. You start to become a good warrior. So that means you know how to use force and you know how to deploy firepower when required, but you're not what they call a red knight. You're not like bouncing along on the balls of your feet looking for a fight, like you see some young guys in town, all muscled up and sort of, that kind of energy. Whereas the Black Knight is much more like, not a show off. He doesn't show his weapons. He does not pull out his sword or his gun unless he really has to, because the conditions require it. But he's not just like, hey, look at my gun.
Mm-hmm.
This is for shooting. This is for fun. Because
right.
the regress warrior also disrespects the feminine. So, there's all of those things, we can't go into it all, but there's, there are all these layers. So in my monastic training, became aware of all of those things and how the training was helping align me with the good warrior. See, there's 4 quarters or 4 powers that exist, I believe, archetypally: king, warrior, magician, lover, or in the Buddhist tradition, we call them faith, energy, mindfulness, serenity, and wisdom. And they're basically, they're 2, a Western and Eastern description of the same thing. Okay, so we have these energies in the Kundalini. You could say they're aspects of this great voltage power, this great force, and they have healthy expressions and they have regressed expressions, but they're all extremely potent. And and this is the issue we're faced with. So, for example, and everyone will have seen this when it comes to the king archetype, the healthy expression of the king is blessing, power. And when you go to see Prince Charles, you're not really going to see Prince Charles. You're actually hoping to be seen by Prince Charles. And it's his act of seeing you that makes you feel somehow blessed. And that's an archetype, and it's all like, I mean, the British are somehow really good at living the mythology of these archetypes out. The whole red carpet thing is insulating the king from being grounded so he can stay connected to the divine. The crown is to do with the crown chakra and connection to the divine, etc., etc. So, there's all of this. But the regressed forms are very interesting because that's what we encounter more often than not. Not a man or a woman that blesses us, but a man or a woman that has either one of these 2 poles of the regressed expression of the good person, the good king. They're either, I'm something, you're nothing. I'm the center. You're not the center. Gaze upon me. So it's like when you go to see your supervisor at university to discuss your work and he ends up talking about his own work more than your work. I'm the center. You're not. And you don't get the blessing. So you sort of somehow still feel unformed in some way. Or the other pole is, I'm nothing, you're something, you're the center. And those are people who are, in a way, abdicating responsibility for the work required to come into association with this Kundalini force. They don't want to do that work, but they want to be associated with it by proxy through somebody else who's embodying it for them.
Right.
And I can go through all these different spheres have these kind of dynamics. And once you start to get this pattern, it really helps you navigate what's going on in the psyche and everything with a lot more clarity.
It's fascinating. It's fascinating, your connection between the archetypes of the king, and I guess you didn't say it directly, but maybe it's the guru. One could say that the cult leader type guru that takes advantage of those people who want to abdicate, the responsibility and revere. And
the real image of the king or queen, because there's a feminine and masculine expression, is sitting in the throne, which is a state of serenity, being in the seat of power, being in your own seat of power. And the Jungians say it emerges in the culture in dreams. When we dream about cars have to do with being in the seat of power. And often people have dreams of their car on ice and skidding and being out of control and everything, these very common dreams. So it suggests you're not really fully rooted in your power, secured in it in some way.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, we could do a whole other podcast on this because it's a huge subject. We can't cover it all. But let's just very quickly go through the other 3, just so you have the very basic map. So you have, for the warrior, the regressed pole is either the sadist, where they stick the sword in you, or the masochist, where you have a wound that fits the knife or the sword and you let someone stick it in you. And the way they describe the masochist is the nice guy or the nice girl. So being a Buddhist or being spiritual isn't just about being nice. It's about being alert and responsive. So it can be, if you're a spiritual person, you can be very wrathful, in the pursuit of truth. If that's what becomes necessary, you'll really try and swing the sword and kill off what is damaging to the people. So then when it comes to the magician, you have the manipulator on the one hand, and the passive aggressive on the other. So it's kind of invisible. It's like your egg's overdone. It's not quite the way you want it, but my egg's fine. Or sorry, I forgot to take the bins out. You didn't forget to take the bins out. It was a form of passive aggression. And the good magician then is always in relationship to the king, so it informs the king, it's the archetype of understanding. So then in the fourth sphere of faith or the lover is either, on the one hand, it is the dynamic of addiction, where you become shaped around false centers of aliveness, like, stamp collecting or alcohol or sex or whatever it is. There you experience a real sense of elevated aliveness, but only in association with that ritual surrounding that thing. It's not unconditional aliveness. If you have to just sit in a chair in an empty room, you'll probably lose your mind. So, and then that's the active side, and the passive side of the lover would be impotence, which is expressed through the experience of boredom. So if you're ever bored, this is an issue to do with that, because in essence, there's nothing boring about being alive. So that is a very, very brief kind of overview. So all of this stuff gets worked on and polished up until ultimately you become like the royal person who can, in traditionally say, dance the four quarters, enter all four of these spaces in a mature way when needed.
Fantastic. Thank you. That's really interesting. I always like to see the way that we can integrate some of the Western ideas into what is traditionally, Eastern spiritual approaches and traditions. So thank you. That's interesting. I'm generally familiar with Jung, but I've got to dive some more into some of his work. I was curious. So one topic that I've discussed throughout the series is very relevant to me on my journey. I always like to ask anybody that I have on that's here for an interview is, what is your relationship like with the divine? I like to relate with the divine for the most part as the divine mother, Kundalini Shakti. So I perceive her to be this embodied mothering figure, energy, force. But that's not a universal experience. And so I'm curious, do you have a relationship with the divine in some capacity? And what is that?
Yeah, well, I think in terms of a ego self-access. So I think I always think in those terms. And maybe a sort of everyday image of that would be like, okay, it's a military image, but these giant oil tanker planes that fly and fuel these other jets, little jets. It's like the divine is like this mothership, and the jets is like it's my big self, and then the jet is like my human self, and I have to come into a very careful and balanced relationship to it. If I get too close, it's going to be a big explosion and I'm going to become psychotic. If I stay too far away, I'm not going to get any fuel from it, and I'm going to just hit the earth and not feel alive and feel jealous of other people for not feeling alive. So I have to find this balanced place where I can sip on its power without identifying with it as being me. So, and then I might image that experience if I, may say, well, I want a dialogue with this thing, so I may image it as Mother Mary or as the Divine Mother in some way. So sure, this is sort of establishing the dynamic of prayer. And I do think conscious prayer, is a real thing. It's not like saying, please God, give me a Ferrari. It's more like, recognizing that there is this beauty, there is this blessing, there is this transformative being that is taking you on this journey, that you're in association with, and consciously approaching it, respectfully, and saying or doing or making all the right signals, and ritualizing that relationship so you can contain it with signs that are identifiable, that give you some structure. For example, having a little shrine or something, or something in your room gives you a physical orientation, so it's not just totally nebulous. So yeah, I do have these, and I would encourage and accept the appropriateness of having these relationships. So there's this idea, which is very, very interesting, you probably not come across it, called the collapsing of the sacred canopy.
I have not.
So the collapsing of the sacred canopy is when all of these energies kind of internally, it's like the constellation of the night sky kind of collapses in on you, and everything's identified as personal, as me and mine. So you feel the force of Kundalini coming through you, and you think it's you. You identify with it as being you, and there's no separation between you and it. Whereas the resurrecting of the sacred canopy is establishing this constellation of energies within your psyche, like a constellation of stars that you are beings or divine beings, and you can use the convention of images or gods and goddesses as you choose, as you wish, as a means for resurrecting this canopy and separating your human self from all of this infinitely high voltage material that you'll never be able to fully humanize. And so you have to find a way of drawing on it while staying human, because if you don't, then what you get is, in a sense, Putin's an example of this in a way, because what he's done is everyone needs an expression of this aliveness in one form or another, even if it's unconscious. So unconsciously, he's othered the Ukrainians, he's made them into an enemy. And then he's deployed all these massive weapons of war, that are full of all this anger and rage and power, all this archetypal power on them to rain down death on them. So this is what happens. It doesn't mean that if you're out of association with these energies that they go away. It means if you have an unconscious relationship to them, bad things happen.
Right.
But the energies have to find a means of expression. All this alluding to nuclear weapons and everything, this is all like Kundalini fantasy, inspired fantasy, coming out of someone who's got an unconscious, unhealthy, sick relationship with those energies. Right. And seeking to express them in this regressed way.
And we see it on smaller scales too, within the average person's individual life. They may have their own sort of nuclear wars on a smaller scale.
Well, it's beginning to happen more and more with people completely believing their own point of view, as if it's the God-given truth. It's not. These points of view, like the Trump people, the MAGA people, they're expressing these points of view with such a force, with such grandiosity, that it completely obliterates their human intelligence. It's archetypal what's happening, and because they don't have, their self-structure is so weak, so undeveloped, that these, and the sacred canopy is collapsed in on them, then in a sense these ideas they have are charged with the electricity of of divinity. They're kind of godlike in their in and you know that the aliveness they then get from association with that godlike energy is something they don't want to lose, so they will not let it be taken away from them. But
Right.
it's very unevolved.
Yeah. To put it simply, yeah, very unevolved. Interesting stuff. Mahesi, you've shared a lot of really fascinating things from your journey, your story. I have really appreciate the Buddhist perspective that you've shared with us. Some really potent teachings. You've brought some structure to things that some respects have no structure for many on this path. They're just sort of, going through it in the dark. And I really appreciate that. Clearly, your time training as a monk and engaging in the Buddhist teachings have served you well to bring you to a point of stability where now you can share with others and support them. So I thank you for that. And I know that you have some work online, and I'd just like to invite our audience to connect with you if they would like to explore some more of your teachings. I know you have a YouTube channel, which I will include in the description as well.
I've got to be honest.
Channel.
I've got to be honest. I don't post on the YouTube channel that often, but I would like to do more of it. So if you subscribe, it might inspire me actually to get it together to do some more.
Yeah, go ahead and subscribe, and you do have some great videos from the past up there that are still timeless and very relevant, and I appreciate those as well. You've got a website. You can let people know what your website is and some of the things that you offer there and how they can connect with you.
Yeah, it's just 4 letters, SATI.co, like in company, not .com, but .co, like in company. So sati.co. Take you there.
Okay, and I'll put that in the description as well, and there people can connect with you if they're interested in some of the spiritual contemplative counseling that you offer, some spiritual direction. You host some retreats, you've got some classes as well. I feel like we've just barely scratched the surface here today about some of the practices and ideas.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk to you again at some point, maybe, in the future. We can see if we can get into some more material.
Yeah, that would be exciting. And then for those who feel, like some of the ideas Mahesi shared here, you shared some really practical tips for being in the midst of difficult experiences. If you're listening and you feel like, I want to really have some more clarity on those, you can connect with Mahesi, and I think you offer one-on-one support as well for those who would like to go a little deeper with you. Great. Thank you so much, Mahesi. Today, it's been a really, really exciting conversation. I've got a lot out of it. I'm going to have to listen back and do a little bit of meditation and contemplation on the things that you shared. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Okay, pleasure. Always like to talk about this stuff.
Right. I feel like we've had to cut in a bit of an abrupt way, but we are getting a little lengthy on the time here. So for our audience, please reach out, connect with Mahesi. For those listening, if you'd like to check out some of the other interviews that I've got with other great, wise people just like Mahesi, you can visit brentspirit.com. You can also check out the other interviews and parts of the series on my YouTube channel, as well as on Spotify and Apple for the podcast. Thank you all for your attention today. And until next time, much love and peace.